lot of talk about homelessness recently here in New York City. The feeling is that it is worse than ever before. Some of that is alarmist and often exaggerated fear of rising crime. But when it comes to homelessness, the data backs the perception up. More people are homeless now than since the Great Depression. According to studies by the Coalition for the Homeless, the number of homeless New Yorkers sleeping in shelters is up 15% in the past 10 years. The overall number of homeless single adults has risen an astronomical 92%. Now, folks have taken notice with a range of reactions. In our own neighborhood here on the Upper West Side, where this congregation is, when homeless folks were housed at the Lucerne Hotel during the pandemic, a bitter battle erupted between people who saw the housing as compassionate and those who saw it as blight. It got ugly. A noose was hung in front of the hotel. Citizens complained that the neighborhood was going downhill, and parents worried that their children were unsafe. Our politicians noticed as well. Last fall, our mayor, Eric Adams, put forward a policy that homeless folks could be forcibly removed from the street by police and hospitalized. He argued that this was for their own good. They could finally get the treatment that they needed. And the public good would be served as well. Cleaner streets, parks, and trains. Now, I know that most people in New York City probably would prefer to not have homeless folks around. Part of that, hopefully, is a humanitarian reason. The hope that those who are currently privileged enough to be housed are saddened that anyone in this city of such great wealth and privilege have to live without a permanent place to be. They want, for those people, a better life. But let's not be naive either and pretend that concern about homelessness is the same as concern for the homeless. Many people simply want them gone. It is more an aesthetic concern than anything else. The homeless are unpleasing to the senses. To many, they make the beautiful park ugly. What is often unstated but widely felt is that it would be better for everyone if they were just removed from public view. The forced coercion by the police through Adams' new policy is just one example of that often unstated sentiment. The fact is, unfortunately, that there are not enough hospital beds for mentally ill homeless folks, nor is the process of outpatient treatment after release especially effective. Often people are released with prescriptions and plans, but without a place to stay, and unsurprisingly, they return to homelessness once again, with all its dangers and instabilities that lead and further mental illness and addiction. Our cities and many of our assumptions about models for addressing homelessness, they are founded on two false and harmful assumptions. First is that people who are homeless willfully, that they are choosing in some obstinate, obnoxious way to inflict their presence on the public, maybe because they feel like it, or they're lazy or refuse to work, or possess some moral failing that leads them to do such a thing. Second, that if you treat whatever problem they are having, whether it's an addiction or mental illness, that they would no longer be homeless. Thus, it is humane to force a homeless person into a hospital for treatment because it will give them the tools they need to overcome their mental illness or addiction. They'll turn their life around and they will be cured. Part of being Unitarian Universalists, the tradition of our congregation, is that we are science-driven. We are data-driven. We believe in reason and rationality. And so it is important that we understand what actually causes homelessness. Mental illness and addiction are not the primary reasons for homelessness. Many people think they are, but they are not. Homelessness is about a lack of housing. It is easy to blame mental illness especially. Mental illness makes it their problem. It doesn't have to do with anything the majority of housed people have to worry about, how we may live our lives, those of us who are privileged to have a roof over our heads. Focusing on mental illness and also addiction lets us just treat the individual, give them medications, and make the problem and them go away. Homeless people are just people with personal problems. We should help them, of course, through treatment and services and counseling, but it's not really about the rest of us. Let us be honest that this sounds a lot like another argument, an argument that most of us on the left deplore, an argument we hear from the conservative right that blames the mentally ill for gun violence. We know, as reason-based, scientist-based, data-driven-based people, that the true reason for gun violence is the availability of guns. We know that most people with mental illness are not violent, but it is easier and more convenient to bray about mental illness and then deal with the real underlying structural problems. That would require real change and hard work and sacrifice in giving up something that we enjoy. Now, the left's belief that mental illness causes homelessness is similarly misguided, perhaps not with the conspicuously insincerity of the right or the duplicitousness of the mental health argument around guns. But the result is the same, blaming individuals for a societal problem. It's an effort to avoid the more difficult and painful structural solutions that we need when it comes to combating homelessness. For politicians like Adams, it is easy to act macho, to throw the weight of the police around at problems, as if the homeless are some wayward youth or rebellious child who need a timeout in a hospital bed before learning the errancy of their ways. It is easy, as our nation does with our prison system, to score political points by removing people that the wealthy, the comfortable, feel uncomfortable around. Our leaders cynically understand that most people complaining about homeless will forget that these individuals exist the minute they vanish from view. Just like most Americans think little about the millions of Americans incarcerated, more people than any other country in the world. Politicians and leaders recognize that these people who are put away, whether because of mental illness or a system of incarceration, these people are disproportionately Black and brown, disproportionately queer and transgender, and they feed into structural and sometimes overt racism and prejudice that normalizes removing these people from society as an acceptable and unavoidable reality. And so our city takes the homeless person off the park bench, out of the train, move them to institutions and shelters far away from areas where the middle class and the wealthy live. The middle class and wealthy whose political power is so often aligned against the poor. And then our government is applauded for valiantly standing up to a public menace. But this, friends, is theater. It is cheap political talk. It pretends to treat the root causes of homelessness while knowingly treating only their symptoms in order to look tough and effective and politically astute. It treats people suffering from real and preventable trauma as essentially criminals. Again, homelessness is not about mental illness or addiction. It's not about criminality. It is about a lack of housing. How do we know this? We know because study after study tells us. We know because statistics show that the overwhelming factor in places where high rates of homelessness exist are also the places where high housing costs, not a lack of social services, exist. Places with the highest rates of homelessness, places like New York City and the West Coast, have some of the best social services available, especially compared to places like the South, like Florida and Texas, where they proportionally have far fewer homeless people. It's because there's affordable housing there. It turns out that what makes people homeless is not being able to afford a home. It is living so rent poor that the minute your life takes a turn for the worst, you have no wiggle room, so you lose your home. Certainly, mental illness and addiction can contribute to this. But if a person can afford a place to live, then even those who struggle remain housed because they aren't living on that razor edge of poverty. We only have to look at Florida and Texas and other places in the South, places that we in New York City, the liberal beacon, don't look at for solutions to our problems. But there, when people have affordable housing, they overwhelmingly take it, and homelessness is less. And when it is not available here on the West Coast and other high-density cities, people have no place but to find shelters, which are often dangerous, or live in the street. The problem here and in New York City and elsewhere is that we simply don't have enough homes. There are not enough places that are available for people to live. We need to build more. We need to build them everywhere. The solution is both complex and simple. There are tons of unwieldy rules and laws and dysfunctional landlords and regulations that make building housing difficult in this city. And it is expensive. That is the complicated part. But what is simple to understand that we can do as people, as individuals, and as a community is to recognize that part of what is holding up affordable housing in this city is that many New Yorkers are prejudiced against the poor. It's not just that people don't want homeless people living on the streets. It's that they also don't want them living down the hall from them, or next door, or down the block. The issue is not just an aversion to homelessness, it is to the people themselves and what they represent and all the fears that they bring up for so many people in this city. You may have heard the phrase NIMBYism. This stands for not in my backyardism. It is common in New York City and in many places of privilege and wealth and even to the middle class. But it is also, when speaking of homelessness, an insidious and immoral stain on our moral character. It is all too common in our city, which happily parades around the concept of diversity, so long as it doesn't make the privileged amongst us uncomfortable or affect our feelings of safety or lowers the values of our home. It is a denial of our first Unitarian Universalist principle that recognizes the inherent worth and dignity of every person. It is so easy to accuse Texas and Florida of being hostile, for example, to migrants, many of whom now are homeless on our streets. But when they are here in New York City, so many change their tune. We should applaud just this week, our governor put forward a budget that required this city increasing housing by 3%. How that happens is an open question. But don't believe that this 3% won't involve change. Don't believe that homelessness can be fixed without massive investment in new housing. What we can do is look for opportunities to support development, affordable development, not development for billionaires and high-rise apartments. We can make sure that we are the voices for that kind of building that makes our city more equal and diverse and compassionate. We can push back against the fear-mongering, against those who warn us that our neighborhood will go downhill, that the family-friendly quality of our community will be at stake, that the children will be afraid. And instead, suggest that what makes our city great, what makes America great, is that we turn no one away, that everyone is welcome here. We can refuse a convenient, politically easy magical thinking that argues that homelessness can be solved by police alone, psychologists alone, social workers alone. We can push back against the narrative that new housing is innately at odds with historic preservation, something, at least in this neighborhood, people care a lot about. I want us to be able to condemn the notion that homelessness is about individual failings or immorality, or that homelessness is not as rare as we believe. We can bring humility, remembering that no one here is immune to addiction or trauma or mental illness, and that those of us who are maybe okay right now may not be so later. The housed are not housed because they are better people, but because they are more fortunate in this moment. So let us insist again and again that if we actually do care about homelessness, if we actually do care about those people who are homeless, or even just housing insecure, that we will do everything we can, not to talk tropes and cliches about more funding for social workers and psychologists or police, if that will somehow magically fix the problem. That we will support more permanent, safe, affordable housing in this city, even if it means changes to our community, to our neighborhood, to our street, maybe to our building itself. We will remember that the first principle of our tradition means that everyone deserves a place to live. Everyone deserves safety and shelter. That first principle applies here and now too. May we help make it so in this city we love. Amen.
Hi, Reverend Schuyler.
Hey, Deb.
Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here with you.
Yes, thank you. So I want to jump right in. Your message today was about homelessness. What brought this up for you? Like, what inspired it? Why now? I find like your messages are always so timely, but why now? And this specific message.
Yeah, so there's a lot of conversation right now in New York City, especially, but also all over the United States about homelessness. There's a very clear rise in homelessness right now that we're seeing. And that's led a lot of politicians, a lot of government agencies and mayors to take action and implement new policies. And so one of those was something done in New York that our mayor, Eric Adams, implemented in the fall. And so and I think it was had mixed reviews, but it's a powerful, I think, moment in time for us to reflect on what does it mean to have people in our midst who are not housed and don't have a place to live, or who live in shelters, or are just housing unstable. And so it's a real important conversation. We talk about how there's more homeless folks now than there have been since the Great Depression. So it's a real issue. And I think particularly in New York, where it is so easy to dismiss them and walk by folks who are homeless and say, well, that's their problem, not my problem, or, well, mental illness or addiction, right? To really be clear about what the reasons are behind it, and that there's a lot of people who I think consider themselves liberal or progressive that oppose the kind of solution that we need, which is actually more housing, right? Especially, there's a lot of, I talk about NIMBYism. There's a lot of NIMBYs, not in my backyardism, that happens on the Upper West Side for a whole lot of reasons. But I think it's important for us to have some clarity around how that intersects with our issues with homelessness and affordable housing, and that you really can't solve all those issues unless you're willing to let go of some of your NIMBYism, which is particularly among people of privilege.
Wow, yeah, that's very true. It is very easy to try to like walk by, or Moses and I were, my son were walking into church today, and there were like two people like that were homeless or without a home on the street, sleeping, maybe in a sleeping bag covered. I struggle with the message. I appreciate you naming that it's not always about mental health. It's not always about the things we've been told or the narratives we've heard that are easy. And so I have moved away in the past from like, oh, giving someone $5 or $1 because I'm worried like, oh, they may buy drugs or, but I moved away from that and I've given an apple. I'll carry an extra granola bar with me. I love that you pointed to like structural things we can do to support. Do you have any advice for the day-to-day if you see someone like honoring their dignity and being empathetic, but I feel like I want to fix something and I know it's a longer and a bigger thing, but do you have any ideas or suggestions for that? Or these
I think it's a very great practical question. And I think, one of the things that is so striking about homelessness, right, is that it's there are all kinds of really devastating and powerful inequalities in our structure, in our system, in our country, in our world that we just don't encounter on a daily basis, right? Like those people who can't afford medication, right? Like we don't see them struggling with their health on the street in a very visible, like disturbing way. And so homelessness in some ways is it is sort of the outward manifestation of a whole host of other issues, whether it is, mental illness or addiction, or a lack of, real medical care that a lot of folks who are in poverty experience, right? And of course, there's a difference between like people who are chronically homeless and those people who are sort of temporarily or experiencing homelessness in that moment. And I think it's very easy to sort of like pin like these are homeless people versus like, there are a lot of people and there are people in our congregation that have been homeless and are not now, and you would not necessarily think that they would have been, but they are, and so, or they were. And we have people who literally are at times homeless in our congregation. And so being clear that it's not like an identity that people, I think our moves us to a place of greater compassion as well towards folks. So, I think there's definitely myths in our society about like somehow it's the old classic welfare queen trope, right? Full of racist baggage, created by I think folks who wanted to chip away at the social network that really protects a lot of people, right? I don't think generosity is ever a bad thing. Whether it's $1 or $2 to somebody who is asking for it, those folks are not getting rich off of sitting there with their can or their cardboard sign, right? Like whether they use it for drugs or not, or they just use it for a coffee or for a bagel or whatever. I think there is some dignity that one offers them by being generous financially, or like you said, like with giving them a granola bar if you have, or a piece of fruit, to recognize that that they may be hungry. One of the things that we try to do at the congregation is have a list of homeless shelters, but also food pantries that folks can go to and be directed to if they need support, whether that's something that people want or not. And so I think if people have a sense of where are those places in my neighborhood, that if someone asks, all right, can you get me some food, you should feel okay doing that, going to a grocery store with them if there's a market or a convenience store. But you can also say, oh, I know that, on Tuesday nights, such and such a church has a food pantry, or, the West Side Campaign Against Hunger has a place on 86 in West End where you can go. So being aware of kind of where those places are, I think it can be helpful. But, you will not, I don't think it's ever immoral to give money or food or some kind of something to people who are on the street. It's not going to break their life. They're not living the high life there with the people throw them. And so if you're worried about being taken advantage of, I think that's kind of.
I'm recording, buddy. Sorry.
Okay.
I agree with you. It reminds me of one of the scriptures, like many of you have entertained angels or something, like you've been unaware, but you've entertained, like just being kind and giving and putting good energy out into the world is always a positive, hopefully thing.
I think that's absolutely true. And to recognize that a lot of the folks who are struggling who are on the street are not people who have had easy lives, right? Like they're not those in this. They're not people who are somehow worse people than you or I are fortunate to have a place to stay at night. They're people who often grew up in really painful environments who, have struggled with a lot of things, and that our society is not taking care of them as we should have. And that's true for people who are born into poverty, but it's also true a large part of homelessness in big cities are transgender teens, queer teens who've been kicked out of their parents' homes.
Yeah.
And so a lot of folks, it's a very complex issue. And so I think we have this idea of like who these folks are. And we really need to, I think, move away from these tropes that have been used and I think cultivated in our society to be used as reasons to cut social services and to be compassionate and move from a place where we see their humanity, and then be willing to do what actually is helpful for them, which is to make sure we have housing, right? And that's often more difficult and complicated and expensive. And also you face people who have a lot of privilege who don't want public housing built in their communities, right? Or they worry about the children or whatever, you and I both and like,
Right.
With the Lucerne Hotel drama that happened on the Upper West Side during the pandemic, that was a hugely overblown crisis that people seem to pretend was real. And I remember walking by multiple times during that and literally seeing nothing. The hotel restaurant that was there, which is a very nice hotel restaurant that's like clearly appeals to kind of an upper class clientele, was on record by saying we never had any issues with the folks who were staying there. And so a lot of this, I think, there's fear mongering. There's some degree of hysteria around what will be like, but we have to overcome that. And as people of faith who really say we believe in things about inherent worth and dignity, right? Like, we have to be willing to stand up against that NIMBY tendency that we all have to some level, but be more aware of it is important.
Thank you. As we end, my final question is, were there things that you had to cut or you couldn't include in the message for whatever reason?
Yeah, I think ideally I would have been able to talk more about the specifics of the Upper West Side and New York in general. There's a lot there that I think culturally is impactful. I think some of the most like enlightening and also disturbing things I've seen during my time at Fourth Universalist is going to like preservation committee meetings or like town halls, and just the level of vitriol and self-righteousness and anger directed at people who are looking for creative solutions around housing, and this conflict between preservation of the neighborhood and affordable housing. It feels like a false conflict, and also feels like a unnecessarily emotionally charged one where people are living in places of fear and anxiety rather than sort of hopeful solutions. And that maybe that'll be another sermon, particularly if things escalate with our with homelessness in the city. But I do think that Deb, as you know, like we are a steward of a historic building in a landmark district. I have spent a huge amount of my life in the last 6.5 years working hard to preserve this building and this neighborhood that it is part of. And so that's a very near and dear issue to my heart. And also, like, I don't see that as somehow opposed to the issue of affordable housing. And I think as people who live in this city and live and care about this city have to be able to be creative and imagine a world where those two things work together and complement rather than threaten each other.
Thank you. All wonderful, good points. much more reflection to come, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you. Great talking to you. Thanks for
You
listening.
too.
Everybody. Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.